time building the temple at Babylon.
But
These are the working tools, so that's they're all symbolic to us, you see. So that's the third degree working tool. This one here, that's the second degree working tools.
how old?
Maybe
we could take the photos. But that's, well, when it's, if we could go on stage, I'll just make it and then the...
yeah, the first provincial because it was, and then we had to wait a year before the English one came out, because it had to come out by later. Yeah. Did you? Bruce. Hello. Oh, is this Bruce, is it? Oh. Bruce. Bruce. No, Bruce. I should go. Just up the stage.
So just if we, that's quite dark at the back, so you take the Sean, do you think it's not too bad, but we'll just...
Wait a minute, we've got one of those got there. Barry! Come on, come in up here.
I know, I just can't see. Do you not want to be in it? Okay, yep, that looks great. That looks really great.
All right. Okay, firstly, on behalf of the Master, I would like to welcome you all to this special occasion where we've brought the Pacific Lodge of Hokitika back to its original building, and Doug Stapleton he'll explain all that further. I'm not going to elaborate anything on that, Doug, because if I did, Doug would say to me, you don't know what you're talking about, which is fine. But it's just a cordial invitation to Your Worship the Mayor, Bruce Smith, who's the Mayor of Hokitika. Welcome, Bruce, to you, and thank you on behalf of the Pacific Lodge of Hokitika for making the effort of coming, and we look forward to having your attendance later on tonight. A special welcome to our Deputy District Grand Master, John Soper, and his wife Marie, from coming over from Christchurch. We have an apology from the District Grand Master, Richard Taylor, who unfortunately has got another song. Now, what I'm going to ask though at this stage for you, this is the only formal part of this stage, is I'm going to ask you all to stand in a moment and come to the sign from the Masons, come to the sign of reverence. The ladies, you can please yourself, what you do, but it's really, you all know at this stage that His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh passed away last night, and so just briefly a little bit of history, because he was a Mason also. We offer sincere condolences to Her Majesty, and just a wee bit of background of His Royal Highness Prince Philip. He joined Masonry in 1952 at the age of 31 years. He joined the Navy Lodge, which was a Masonic Lodge number 2612, on the 5th of December 1952. The 6th of March 1953 he did his second degree, and on the 7th of May on the 4th of May, I beg your pardon, and he did his third degree in 1953. He received his Grand Lodge English certificate on the 7th of May 1953. So I'm going to ask you to stand just for a couple of moments in remembrance of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Doug, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Ladies and brethren, that's one of the shortest speeches I've ever heard Bruce Russell make. Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to introduce Bruce Smith, His Worship the Mayor of Westland District Council, and delighted to have you here. And I must say, the collar jewel that you've got puts ours to shame, Bruce. Good. We'll give you an apron, but Bruce is going to say a few words to us. So, Bruce, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our little town. And it is a little town. And it's wonderful to see you here and for us to have been able to arrange for some rain to greet you, which is it's something we can't always do. 5 kilometres to the east is the Crop River, and it'll get 12 metres of rain this year. Unfortunately, out here on the coast, we can't do that. To those of you that have travelled here today, and I know some have come from Tauranga, really appreciate you coming. Thank you so much, and have a safe trip home. Tuesday, the 20th of December, 1864, marked the founding of Hokitika. The day the SS Nelson, 123 tonnes, landed a cargo of stores and diggers at the Hokitika port. This was the first time that Europeans had braved the often dangerous channel leading into the river. It is estimated that over 37,000 people disembarked at the Hokitika port between 1865 and 1867. And in 1866 alone, over 40% of all the immigrants that came into New Zealand came through Hokitika. The town was officially gazetted a port in March of 1865 after a careful survey by Captain Frederick Gibson. By October of 1866, there was wharfage for 15 vessels. In 1866, the Hokitika port was the second largest in New Zealand, and it had the largest number of exports as the easy gold was being recovered and shipped out. And in this bustling town, this largest, believed to be the largest growing town in Australasia, lodge number 1220, was consecrated in March of 1865, right at the birth of our town. And apart from the war years, has operated continuously for the past 156 years. It first met in a number of temporary rooms, all of which are in Revel Street, the street outside here. Every one of the meeting rooms was in Revel Street, until its purpose-built rooms were occupied in 1906. Some of you here were around then, but not many. Just joking. So you in the West Coast, in the early years, there were many Masonic lodges on the coast, and the Pacific was the oldest. It left Hokitika in 1978, and it meets now in Christchurch. And today's meeting is the first in 43 years in Hokitika, and I'm delighted to be part of it. Will it be the last? Only the members vote no. Only the members will determine that. Today, lodges remain in Greymouth and Westport, and during its life, it had many local men as members, and I see some here today. It was the Masonic home, it was the centre. It was where the men connected with their beliefs and their faiths, and their courages going forward. And it was a home to well over 1,000 men over the period of time. Please enjoy your stay in Hokitika. It's been my pleasure to formally welcome you, and I'm looking forward to joining you tonight for a meal at the Workingmen's Club. Thank you very much.
Right, Doug.
I've got a hard act to follow, but I'll try. Just a few short notes about the history of the lodge. To me, and I'm sure to many of us, reflection is a place as well as a saying. Think about for a moment of 1865, where you are now. The port just down the road, the Tasman Sea just out the back, numerous shipwrecks, the noise of bustling people wading through the mud going up Rebel Street. The merchants, the wagons, the horses, the dogs, the dance hall girls, the hoteliers, the prostitutes, they were all here. And I would imagine that a damp smell pervaded the area because of the swamp and the afforestation that was prevalent right where the town is now. Just up the road in the muddy street, there were many brothels, dance halls, gambling dens, and gold buyers, and shopkeepers. The wharf area had at times up to 60 sailing ships berthed at one time, many from Sydney, Melbourne, Dunedin, Nelson, and Littleton. In this bustling primitive town, there were men that hailed from all over the world, from the United States, from Europe, from the United Kingdom, and from Australia. And they brought many things with them, but they brought, importantly, Freemasonry. They had been Freemasons in an earlier life. There were few women at that time, and Eleanor Catton, the Canadian author, wrote a book called The Luminaries, and those of us that went through the museum today saw the display. And she wrote very much the content of a book, The Luminaries, set in this immediate old part of the town. Lodges had been consecrated here throughout New Zealand in the Irish, Scottish and English constitutions. But a lot of those old lodges surrendered their charters in 1892 when the United Grand Lodge of England was formed. And on the west coast, Phoenix Lodge in Westport, and the men here from Westport today, Greymouth Lodge and Pacific remain true right until this day under the United Grand Lodge of England. In March of 1865, a group met at Schluter's Hotel, which is just up the road. Schluter had been a Mason in Australia. And they met to discuss the possibility of setting up a Masonic lodge in Hokitika. And soon after, another meeting, only 10 days later, resolved that the lodge would be called the Pacific Lodge of Hokitika. And they applied for a charter. And in those days, the Provincial Grand Lodge was domiciled in Christchurch, although the Canterburyans called this part of the world West Canterbury. I knew not why. They gave the lodge a provisional charter until the formal charter arrived from the United Kingdom. There it is there, the original charter, but it took about 2 years to arrive from London. The master and wardens were nominated and selected, fees were set. An initiation fee was a surprisingly expensive item, 15 guineas. Joining fare from a Mason coming from elsewhere was 5 guineas. And for each degree work they charged the candidate or the person undergoing the degree working another guinea. So that was a lot of money in those days. Bylaws were drafted, and on February the 8th, 1866, the first formal meeting was held in the nearby commercial hotel. And they consecrated the lodge. It was a long, drawn-out affair. It tiled at midday. They initiated 5 new Masons. Another 8 were on the waiting list, and the lodge closed at 7:30 p.m. and a huge banquet, and much liquor was drunk afterwards. By 1867, it had 16 new members, and that trend continued right through until the mid-1870s, when the gold had started to run out. And it gave those men, many of them here by themselves, no wives, no families, something to do other than scratch around for gold. In 1867, Right Worshipful John Lazar joined this lodge from Dunedin, where he was in Dunedin Corporation's first town clerk. He had been a provincial Grand Master in South Australia. He had been Mayor of Adelaide City, He was a highly skilled Freemason, and he became the first District Grand Master of Western. And he travelled far and wide throughout the colony, officiating at all manner of Masonic meetings. He became a member of this lodge, as I've said. He was also extremely prominent in the Jewish religion, and in those days, just up the road, there was the first Jewish temple, and then along further into town, there was the second temple, much bigger, built, and that was burnt down in the 1930s. Fortunately, an elderly Jewish man saved the ancient scrolls, but they since disappeared after being sent to Christchurch. In 1872, Richard John Seddon, later to become Premier of New Zealand, had joined the Tsar Lodge in Kamara, the Tsar Lodge still going strong in Nelson. And he joined this lodge and was a member right through until his death in 1878. He was a very, very prominent Freemason. Seddon, on the other hand, and Lazar argued all day and all night, given a chance. Seddon got struck off by this lodge a few years after joining, because by then he was a bankrupt and he had ignored demands to pay the lodge dues. 100 years ago, the West Coast had 22 what we call blue lodges, the majority of the brethren wearing blue collars and aprons. They had side orders, rose quad like Templars, but slowly but surely they disappeared. There were, strangely enough, given the large Irish population in Hokitika, no Irish lodges ever opened on the West Coast. As I said, in 1892, a lot of the lodges surrendered their charters and joined the Grand Lodge of New Zealand. Friction started between the other lodge that was here in Hokitika, which was originally a Scottish lodge, and then in 1892 became a New Zealand lodge. And they were forever, according to the minute books, arguing over petty things, pinching each other's members and goodness knows what. But they resolved those to the point that discussions started to take place around the 1880s about jointly having a building here in Hokitika. The other lodge used to meet in a building just up Rebel Street here. It was called the Western Chronicle building. It was an old newspaper building. On the ground floor was the newspaper and upstairs was the lodge rooms. And that existed through to 1906 when this building was built, and the other lodge became a tenant of Pacific's. Regular meetings were held except during the war years, and in 1921 His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales visited. He had been a promising Freemason in England, but that all turned to custard when he became King Edward VIII, and he abdicated when he married Wallace Simpson, an American divorcee. In 1923, a ballot was held for a man called Edward M. Best, Police Constable of Canary. In 1926-27, he was master of this lodge, and at the time was the youngest sitting master of any lodge in New Zealand. Tragically, he was murdered by a farmer called Stanley Graham on the 8th of October 1941. In the foyer there's a beautiful disc with a stainless steel plaque which Pacific Lodge had put there in memory of him. In 1958, an initiation of a double first degree for a Sergeant William Watson and Constable Stanley Petrie Dawson, both of the Hokitika Police. Stan remained a member for 50 years, still lives in Hokitika, and he held District Grand rank. In 1974, lodge membership started to decline. There was more serious talk about amalgamation. In February '78, the last Pacific meeting here in Hokitika, and it moves the charter to Amberley. And for whatever reason, the United Grand Lodge of England deemed Pacific Lodge to be irregular, which meant that Pacific Lodge members could not go to a New Zealand lodge and vice versa. And that lasted for 8 years. And quite weirdly enough, the man that was primarily responsible for blackballing this lodge was a man called Raymond John Duncan, who later became Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New Zealand. Hokitika born and bred, a carpenter, and yeah, that was quite strange, but however, that all disappeared. Western Kawilling stayed in the lodge till June 1991, gave in its charter. The land and buildings were sold by both lodges and were sold to the Hokitika Dramatic Society for $13,000 in 1991. Pacific donated their share to a scholarship at the local high school. And the old records, as I said to the group at the museum this morning, discovered in Christchurch in a trunk, were returned to Hokitika and then now stored permanently in the museum. I do not know of any other organisation in Hokitika that has lasted continuously under the same name for 156 years. Many organisations probably came to being at that time, but they changed their names. So the nearby area of the town became derelict, this building included, and just quite recently major building developments have occurred just across the road. And down the road, thanks to Bruce Smith and his council, a major development of what we call Sunset Point. And when I was a kid, it was a god-awful rubbish dump. So a lot of items that came out of this building are in storage at the museum where they will stay. And as Bruce said, a lot of brethren of the lodges here in Hokitika gave a lot to local communities, fire service, etc. And included among them was Samuel Mitchell, Victoria Cross, a soldier during the Maori Wars, buried in the cemetery at Ross. So that's a little bit about the history. Worshipful Master, this is only the second time your lodge has met on the coast since 1978. The previous was at Shantytown in 2006. I hope you've enjoyed these comments and your stay at Hokitika. May the lodge continue well into the years ahead. Thank you.
Could I call on Jason Young, our worshipful master, perhaps just to say a few words and a vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Bush Brother Stapleton for his very good speech on our lodge. I'm a new member to Pacific, and I thought it, timely for us all to come back over here and learn a bit about our roots and where we came from and what makes us our lodge. And when you read more into it and see where it actually comes from, it's amazing. 156 years, but still going strong. And yeah, it's really good to do. So I'd just like to, and also come back over to Hokitika here as well, and see the old building, and which is great that it's still standing here today. And also spend some time in Hokitika and spend some money, which I think would go down very well, especially with the way things have gone with tourism of late. So so thank you very much for coming along, and we'll carry on with the rest of the day.
Could I just, anyway, Jason, just stay there a moment?
Sure.
This jewel that Jason wears is a very valuable jewel, and Doug, you'll know when it was one of the masters. It's about the 1800s. About 1800 that was done. It's solid gold. We have what, 4 or 5 jewels which got a value when we had them valued about 15 years ago. They were valued at about 55,000. They're all gold, and this one is the most precious. It's worn by the master. We have another one that is worn by the deputy, the past master. We have one that's worn by the secretary. We have one that's worn by the treasurer. And as I'm DC, I haven't got it on, it's in my case, I wear one also. But they're valued, and they were ones that the Pacific Lodge had. We had them in storage, never to be seen. And so the lodge made the decision that they would be worn by the varying people, and they are passed on as the office moves the office. Bearer moves on, they are passed on to the next one. But Jason, that's the most valuable one. Just a wee bit of history.